No problem. Okay, no problem.
Okay. Okay.
Normally, when I give this talk, I talk a lot about Dart and some Dart-specific features in the language and why Dart is a cool language and how you would use it in the back end and on the web front end and the mobile front end. But since time is quite limited now and I only have 3/4 of an hour, I would like to skip the theory behind the stuff and the slides and just do a demo of how you would build an application using the Flutter framework, if that is all right with you. So I want to just do some live coding, build an app, see what goes right, what goes wrong, and see if we can create an app together that uses the Flutter framework. And from my understanding, does any one of you already have experience with the Flutter framework? Okay, did you build a complete app or? Still working on it. And how does it fit your style or? It's okay. It's okay.
I think it will make it.
Okay, and how many of you do mobile development? Okay, and you would do mobile development in Xamarin? Xamarin, okay. So let's look at Flutter. It's a new framework created by Google, and it's quite heavily inspired by React, the reactive programming style. The way you would use Flutter is you would download the SDK. It's a GitHub repository. You would download it, set it at a location, and make an environment variable pointing to the directory. And if you would do that, you would have a Flutter command. So let's create an application from scratch. I use Visual Studio Code for this development. Do you all know Visual Studio Code? Okay. So I'm going to... Sorry? From here? I guess so, yeah. Okay, then you would ask someone of the organization. I don't know. Okay, so let me create a new folder, call it JB demo, something like this, and start with a blank sheet. I would start at a terminal, and here you would see an output of a Flutter command. So the only thing I did was I downloaded the SDK, and after the installation I would point to the SDK in my environment variables. Then I get the Flutter command. Flutter has a doctor subcommand, and it tells you how healthy your system is. And upon each question you want to ask on Stack Overflow, they ask you for a doctor report, and then they give you advice based upon the stuff that's mentioned in this listing. But my system seems quite healthy. I have not Android Studio, I haven't got the plugin installed, and I haven't got IntelliJ, so that's no problem in this case. I can create a Flutter project by doing Flutter create and give it a name, JB2. And now it creates a subfolder, and the subfolder is over here. Let's open this subfolder in a new file, in a new window. So in a new file open. That one. And this gives me a directory that has an Android and an iOS subfolder. So Flutter actually compiles to native code that gets executed on simulators or actual devices. Let me show you the out-of-the-box experience. Therefore I go to the terminal again, and I would launch a simulator. So I already have a simulator running, and the end result of my demo should be an application that works as a jukebox. So there's a little bit of animation and a little bit of transition of pages. It has an audio player. So it's the basic stuff of an application. There's transitions, there's animations, there's pushes and long pushes and a list, images, and all sorts of stuff. So let me close this simulator and open it with a clean sheet. Open simulator. So now it starts the simulator. And I can do a flutter.run, or devices to see which devices are connected. Devices. It gives me a list of devices. In this case, I have an iPhone. If I were to plug in my phone in as well, then I could just play my Flutter application on my phone. In this case, I only have one device connected, so when I do Flutter run, it runs on the only device it has a connection to. So now it runs in my iPhone simulator. I could easily start Android Studio as well. Studio. And launch an emulator in Android Studio on the side. So this is the Hello World Flutter app. And let me start a Android application on the side. So there's my Android application. So in this case, I have two applications, or two mobile phones running in this in the setting. And when I were to list my devices, it would say that I have two devices. One is still connecting, and that's the emulator of Android. So this one is our Hello World application of Flutter, and I can count stuff, and it's a fairly simple application. And the other one, after it has booted, if it is going to boot, we could dispatch it to the other phone as well. So let's not wait on this application or this phone to boot up. Let's create an application. So let's get rid of all this stuff. I'm going to use Dart, and the Dart programming language quite resembles a lot of other languages you probably know, C#, Java, JavaScript. It has some specific syntax you probably don't know. If there is something I type and you don't know the meaning of the stuff I type, ask me and I'll fill you in. So that's the way we can do a little bit speed up in the demo. First off, I import an application library. This is the library that is provided by Flutter. It is the material design library. So my application is going to be a material design app, and every Dart application has a main entry point. Yay! So it's not JavaScript and it just executes. It has actually a main entry point, and that's where your application is going to execute. In this case, I want to run an app. It should be a new material app, and the material app has a constructor that takes a home page. Let's name this guy a home page. And so let's get rid of the squigglies over here. It doesn't know about the home page yet, but let me create a class home page that extends a widget. In this case, I'm going to build a widget, and the widget actually is an asset on the screen. And this is where it gets interesting, because of course we know about the Swing libraries and other libraries that were platform independent and gave you the option to draw on the screen like a button or a list view or whatever. But these widgets are quite different in the sense that some of these widgets actually only center stuff or give your widget a padding or a frosted glass look, or it rotates your widget. So the widgets you use actually resemble more the HTML div style kind of stuff than they are complete out-of-the-box usable components. There are components that are usable out of the box, but the composition for your application actually is super easy with these widgets, because they don't force you in some kind of a layout. So that's super nice. especially if you know that the layouts for different devices could vary or should be similar on those different devices. I don't know what's wrong with my Android emulator, but let's stop this one. So let me just use the iPhone emulator, and if we complete the application, I could dispatch the application to my actual device. It is an Android, so you would see that the workings of the application is quite similar and everything works on both devices as expected. So I have my home page, and my home page has an override because it extends a stateless widget on the build method, and the build method takes a build context, and in this method I can create a widget to display. In this case I can return a scaffold. A scaffold is a widget that actually creates a style. It creates certain placeholders like a bottom bar, a body, a top app bar, and that sorts of stuff. Also a place to position a floating action button. So it is sort of a how you would call it, a greater organization of different kind of UI pieces that make up an application. In this case I want to create an app bar, so let's create a scaffold that takes an app bar. That is a new app bar with a title that is of text, and the text says jukebox, something like this. And let's create a body that actually is a container. The container is, resembles a div in HTML, so it's a meaningless div. Container can have a color, like a red color, and then it completes my homepage widget. By restarting the application, yes, we would see the effect on my efforts to make this application a little bit different. So here's my top, my app bar. It has the title and it has a red container in it. The idea is to make a record and let the record spin and let it play a music when we press the record. So let's do that first. So in case of this application with a red filled container, let's create a record card. And the record card can be built up as before, like a record card that extends a stateless widget that has a build function, build context, that returns, well, a container. Let's make the container of a certain size, so let's make it a width of 100, a height of 100, and let's add an image to the container by using what's called a decoration. So the decoration would be a box decoration with an image, and the image would be a record without the image that is spinning inside it. So it's a template record with a gap, with a hole in the middle that's just a white space. I already have something prepared, so somewhere in my desktop is a images folder, and it has a record PNG. So this guy actually suits quite well to use as a background for my record. To add resources to my iPhone app or to my Android app, I can create a folder in this directory. Let's call this folder Assets. And let's create a subfolder in my Asset folder. And that's called IMG for images. And let's drag and drop this record into my folder. So now I have my record inside my folder, inside my Assets folder. And to complete the including of this image into our project, I have to go to the pub spec The pub spec lists it's sort of my package JSON, but then it's for Dart. So it has a name and a description. It lists its dependencies. So if you have your npm install from Node.js, this quite resembles that same scenario. So if I were to have add-ons from other parties, I could list them into the dependency section, and it will grab the dependent modules, would download it, and would install it for me automatically. In this case, I want to include some images into my project. And the thing to do is to uncomment this line. And it actually goes off and runs a Flutter packages get for me. In this case, I want to include assets, img, and then record.png, I guess it was record.png. So after including this image into the assets, I can use the image in my application. In this case, I have an image. It has to be loaded from the assets folder. Its name is assets ing record png, and it gives me an image loaded from the asset. Let's fix the, so it has an image. This is a decoration image that has an image, and that's the image. So there's a couple of nesting of widgets to supply for an image for the background of my container. And if all the closing parentheses are correct, so this is the container, it has a return, then we could rerun this application. And the nice thing about Flutter is you can press the R, the lowercase r, and it would just hot reload this application. So it's quite a nice experience to create your screens, set some values, create some widgets, and refresh your screen on the fly until you have your layout you actually want, and then fill in the data afterwards. So this way of working to create your layouts actually is quite a nice experience. It resembles React Native. I don't know if any one of you has React Native experience, but they also have this experience of hot reloading. So in this case, I have my record. Let's create a slightly larger record. If I want to center this record into my screen, I wrap it in a center widget. And when I wrap it in a center widget like this, it is centered. So that's a nice beginning, but now I want to have an image of an actual record inside this gap over here. So let's create an actual image. Let's see, I have, everybody likes ABBA, so let's get an ABBA image in here. And let's add the ABBA image in my assets. So it has abba.jpg. Let's go back to our main Dart and add a child to this container. So it has a child. The child is an image. The image is an image asset. The asset is assets img abba jpeg. So it gives me an image, and then there's a decoration. Let's refresh this code. So it has the image, but it's slightly large and it obscures the record. In this case, I want to give the image some padding. If you guys are experienced web design developers, then you know what padding means. It compresses the contents with a certain size. So let's give this image a padding. There's a widget for padding as well. So padding takes a padding argument. Let's make it 40 big, and let's give the padding a child, and the child is an image. So now we have a padding nested inside a container, nested inside a center, and the padding has the image. So you would see, oh, I pressed the Q. Q quits the application. But it's super fast, so there's no problem here. Let's make this a slightly larger padding. There it is. And let's refresh this application. So let's make the padding a little bit more. 140 perhaps. That's too big. 120. Yeah, super. So it is a square inside my record. It isn't the inner contents of my record should be a circle, and this is a square, so that doesn't align up. But hey, there's a widget for it as well. So we're going to wrap our image into a clip oval. Child. So in this case, we're going to clip the child as an oval, like this. And let's refresh the application. Now it's perfectly round. So that's cool. It is actually round. Let me show you. See, it is round. So that's nice. So that's our record. And it would be nice if we were to touch the record, then it would spin, and if we would touch it again, it would stop spinning. And there's an animation and support. So let's check the, we have the widget. Now we do interaction. And the interaction is pressing, long pressing, and pressing again, that sort of stuff. So I have a record card inside of my scaffold. And let's wrap this record card here. So this is my root widget. Let's wrap this guy into a gesture detector. So there actually is a widget for interaction as well. The gesture detector takes a child. The child is my center image. And it also has an on tap, which takes a callback function. And in Dart, you would write your callback function like this. So there's no function, no arrow syntax. There is arrow syntax, but it actually is quite different. So this is our anonymous function in Dart syntax. So if I were to print something to the screen, hello, then you would see if I were to press this, it would say hello. But in this case, we want to spin the record instead of printing hello. And this actually introduces the concept of animation. So what I want to do is I want to make this widget so it holds an angle, and each frame I can increment the angle, and the angle would rotate the center of my record. If I want to have state in my widget, I can't keep this widget a stateless widget. The name implies that it doesn't hold state. This is the reactive pattern I told about. So to prevent two-way binding to occur, we always have stateless widgets. And if we want to have state, we create a body class which has the state. And if we manipulate the state, we wrap the state manipulation in a setState function, which invalidates the widget that actually got rendered on the screen. Therefore, it gets repainted on the next frame. So we haven't got any two-way binding. We actually change state of another object that invalidates this object and paints it again with a new configuration. So it actually never changes its own state. It has another object that holds the state. So to demonstrate this, it's the same for React or React Native. That's called sort of reactive programming. So let's create a record card that extends stateful widget, extends stateful full widget, and the record card that extends stateful widget has a record card state that extends state for the record card. So in this way, if this widget is being called to render on the screen, it would pass its build function or its build call to this record card state to build the UI. If this card state has state, something like an angle, when we manipulate this state, we wrap the manipulation in a set state, which invalidates this state, therefore repainting the record card, which has a representation. This guy is actually painted on the screen, and this guy takes care of the painting of that widget. So there's no two-way binding. When we change the state, this guy wraps it in a set state. When we're wrapping it into a set state, that guy gets called to repaint itself again. Yeah? So this has a body that actually is initialized in a create state call. The create state call returns a record card state instance. So this record card state is being kept alive for the duration of the application, and this guy gets recreated each time a configuration changes and calls this build to build the UI. Okay, so in this case, I now can create state. The record card state has this field as state. Let's initialize this state. So it has an initial value of 0. I have to call super in its state as well. And what I want to do is, this guy, I want to give it an animation. So I want to have a way of responding upon each tick of a clock or each frame that gets painted. And then I want to do something in the repaint of a frame. For instance, incrementing the angle, making this widget invalid, therefore repainting the widget on the screen. Yeah? So let's create that setting. So in this case, I want to have a ticker object, and a ticker object actually comes from another library, scheduler. And this ticker object is an object that takes a callback, and the callback has a duration argument. So this ticker can be started like this. And now when I start the ticker, it actually fires off every time a new frame has to be painted or can be painted. And in this case, I want to increment the angle. I don't want it to exceed 360, so I increment the angle. But as I said earlier, I want to wrap this in a set state call. And the set state call actually invalidates the widget, therefore repaints the widget on the next frame. The ticker start actually requires my record card state object to have a mix-in sort of an implementation of an object applied to this object. For those of you who know JavaScript, it's an extend of an object. And in this case, I want to have a mix-in of type single ticker state, single ticker provider state mix-in. So in this case, my object gets a couple of methods, and it gets called when each frame, it gets called through the ticker provider to give me a ticker to apply this code upon each frame. So if I were to execute this code, I would see an increment of each angle. Let's print this. I would see an increment of each angle. And the angle would not exceed 360. Let's try this out. So it actually works. The angle gets incremented. A bug is appearing, but that's not a bug in my software. So this works. Now let's apply this angle to a transformation of my record. In this case, my record has a padding of an oval. Let's add a transform widget to this oval. And the transform widget has a transform property that takes a matrix for rotate x on the z-axis, and it has to something with the pi and the 306. I guess it would be angle times pi divided by 100, sort of. I guess it was something like that. Yeah, positive it is. So let's see if this works. So now my record should be spinning if I refreshed my application a couple of times. So, did I break something? I probably did. Transform clip child oval. Here's the oval. I have to exit from here. Okay. Let's restart this application. There it is. So it actually rotates quite nicely, but it rotates on the upper center, the upper left corner of this widget. So that is nice, but not what we wanted. The transform has an alignment, of course, and the alignment is an alignment that is an enumeration that has a center. So if we refresh this application now, it rotates nicely in the center. So that's cool. But we want to do it on tap. So if we tap, we want to stop the record. If we tap again, we want to start the record. So in this case, we don't want to start the ticker immediately. We want to have a ticker as a field. And then we can use the ticker in the on tap to stop it or start it when needed. So now, in this case, sorry?
Is that an or? Dot.
This one?
No, between stop and tick.
Oh, it's a double dot. So this is the operator that says if this guy is Boolean, then do this, otherwise do that. So now when I click on it, it rotates, and if I click on it again, it stops. So that's nice. So the animation part, let's see that as succeeded as well. I want to, this is fake data. I have hard-coded this stuff here inside of this string, but I already have some data. This could be a class that holds an album. That's one record. Foundation material, I guess. Import material. Yeah, and then something like this. So this is an album that takes an artist, a demo track, album art, track list. Track list takes a list of strings that has the tracks. And I also have a example data set somewhere. Here it is. So there's already, there's already some data inside of this, in this application. There's some sample data of some records that have some URLs to my Firebase database. So let's not get into detail how we did that. Let's just use this stuff. So now I have a list in a playlist variable with a couple of records already in them. So instead of using this record card, let's create a records list and create a widget that extends stateless widget. Stateless widget extends with a D. stateless widget, there it is. Let's override the build with a build context. Build context. So let's return something that resembles a list. So I want to return a list of data. Let's check that as well as one of the things we have accomplished today. So to return a list, actually we want to return a grid. We have a widget, and that's a grid view. Grid view. And the grid view has a builder. It also has a count. Let's use the count. The count is quite nice because the count gives me a cross-axis count. And this says how many rows I would want to have in my grid. So it's a column count. In this case, 3. And the other parameter is the list of widgets we want to have populated in our grid. But in this case, I want to have a list generate. We want to generate a list for each record in the playlist. To import the playlist, I have to import the package models. Is it models? Model.dart. And now I have a playlist which has a length. And the second is a builder for widgets for this grid to use. So if I was correct, I could implement this guy here. It has, one. So my grid view has 3 columns, and it populates the children with the playlist length, that many list items, and the things we want to render are records, card. And now for completeness, let's give the record card a record constructor argument that is provided a playlist item in this case. So the record card doesn't have a constructor argument as of yet, but in this case it's quite easy to create one. So let's make a final album record, and let's create a constructor, record card, that takes a record. Notice that I use parentheses, and I use curly braces, and I use this record. This notation actually assigns the record to itself, and this makes it an optional argument, an optional named argument. So in the optional named argument way of providing, I have a record card that actually has a record optionally named argument, and we fill it with an album. Yeah? So it aligns up. Now, in our record, we have a asset image. So instead of supplying this image, I could use a record, but the record actually doesn't reside on the record card state. It actually is on the record card widget. So it's on the body class instead of the state class. The this would point to our state object, but we also have a widget companion object, and it has a record, and this has an album art. So we point from the state object to our body widget object, and it has the property for the album art. So if all went well, we have a list, and the list actually are a couple of records, and the records have album art, and they should display fine. Let's see if that works. So there they are. It could very well be that the sizing of this insets is quite off track now. So let's do something about that. Oh, and there's one other thing I forgot. I didn't include the images yet. So there are a lot of albums now, and the albums have asset images, but I didn't include the asset images. So let's include those images in here as well. Replace. Let's add the images to this list. So we have some of these Rolling Stones, Queen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, okay. So let's try it again. So there they are. And when I click on them, they rotate. So that's nice. And it's quite silent in here, so let's add some music. We want to play the music that is part of this album, and in my model I have a link to a demo track that is hosted on my Firebase database. So let's see if we can create something that plays. This actually is the introduction to some platform-specific code, because audio players for Android actually work differently than audio players from iOS. And there's no widget that actually plays audio out of the box. But someone in the community has created a player community library we can use. And it has built a plugin that's a platform-specific audio player for iOS and Android. The way it works is you would go to your Android and your iOS folder, and you would create a Objective-C or Swift or Kotlin or Java method channel, and it's just a string. And the method channel gets called by the platform, the Flutter platform, upon request, and the method channel does native code. So you actually have a method channel you can communicate with from your Flutter world to your native world to do stuff. And that's quite a nice way to do platform-dependent stuff. There's also a possibility to create a Flutter screen inside of a native app, or create a native dialog inside of a Flutter app. So that's actually quite easy to do. And there's no time for me to demonstrate that, but someone already has done it, and he has created an audio player. So let's use the audio player, so I can show you how you would include something from the community to use as an add-on on your application. There is a website. The website is called PubSpec, and in the PubSpec, sort of a npm for Dart code is an audio player's plugin. And there it is. So to use this guy, I would copy this line of code or line of markup, go to my Visual Studio Code setup and put a entry of this plugin into this dependencies. I placed it on the wrong spot. I should have placed it on the dependencies, not the dev dependencies. It actually gets the packages immediately. If the exit code is 0, then everything succeeded. Now let's go back to the main code and let's import the library, audio players. It gives me an audio player. Let's use the audio player. So in this case, the record card could have an audio player. Let's create the audio player. And now let's use the audio player. So when we click on the record, in this case, let's re-engineer this to be a if. and then an else. So we can stuff a little bit more code in here. So if we want to start spinning the record, we also want to play audio. So the audio player has to start playing a URL. The URL is our widget record demo track. So that should be it. Let's see if this works. So here's my application. It could take some time because it has to download stuff from the internet. Let's see if this works. Let's get rid of the print statement. It gives me some feedback. Yeah. Okay, so something went wrong. Let's see if I can fix this quickly. Yeah, so missing plugin exception. I added a library. I didn't rebuild my application. I just did a hot reload. But now it actually has to recompile native stuff because I have a pod install or on an Android device. I've stuffed in some activity-derived class. So now I have to actually rebuild the application. So let's do that quickly. Flutter run. It should rebuild. If it doesn't, I have to kill my syncing files. It didn't rebuild. Let's quit this simulator. Let's restart the simulator. YAML the file. Okay, and now let's restart the application. So it actually has to rebuild the application for the plugin to work. Let's run the application. Now it runs a pod install, starting the Xcode build, loading the Flutter resources, compiling, and it deploys the application. And with a little bit of luck, it works. I didn't stop, so now I have a problem. I have to stop the music from playing. So let's fix that as well. So in my main Dart, when I stop the animation, I want the audio player to stop as well. So that completes the playing part. I don't know how much time I still have left. I probably am near the end of tonight's demonstration. How much time do you all have? Is there someone who has to be home in time, or yeah? Okay. So what I wanted to do is let me add a screen transition as well, and then I probably checked all the requirements except for the persistence in this demonstration, and then we're done. And for the people who do not believe that it actually runs on a device, I can show you that my actual device, we can hook up the actual device, push it in there and see it working there as well. This is an Android phone. So let's do two more small things. So in this case, starting the build, I have stopped the audio player when we stop the record. It gets the stuff from the internet, plays, and it stops. It plays. Okay, so that's nice. Now for the screen transition, I want to implement a long press. So when you do a long press, then you transition from one screen to another. In the gesture detection we already have in place, we have a long press. That's not the application. let's mute this. There's an on long press function. And to navigate to another application part, we can go using a widget, navigator of context. The of construction is part of an inherited widget tree where we search up the tree to a navigator object and talk to the navigator object to do stuff for us. For instance, go towards another subtree to display other stuff. The inherited widgets paradigm actually is a quite nice paradigm to share data over your application and do stuff without actually nesting your code all the way down to the tree of your widgets. If you want to know more about that stuff, I advise you to look at a talk from Google where they do data architecture for Flutter. But now let's use the navigator of, in this case, and not create an inherited widget. We want to push a new tree into our application, and it is a material page route, material page route. And the material page route takes a builder, which has a build context. And in the build context, we can return another widget. Let's return a container. Container has a color red, for instance. So in this case, let's just act as if the next page was a container that's totally red. Normally you would add stuff in that widget as well. You would return the second page as a widget instead of just a container. So let's restart the application. And now let's long press and you would see the animation for a new page sliding in. There's also the way where iPhones use navigation controllers where you can swipe back through the page. But you could also use a container with a child that has a back button, because that's a widget as well. And the back button has an icon, or it has text. What does the back button have? A color, okay. Colors white. So now we have a second page that is a red screen, and it crashes, and it says the back button, okay, should be wrapped in a material, of course. Material, child. So the nice thing is it crashed actually, but when we hot reload and when we fix the error, it actually doesn't crash the application. It just keeps on working. So now we have a back button as well, and we can navigate back. So that's as far as the demo goes. Because of the time we have, I already created this demo earlier on, and I will share this code with you on my GitHub repo, but it has the completed results. So this is the same application as we built here. Instead of when I navigate to an application, was it this? It isn't this one. It's another one. Let's see where it is. Okay, so that works. It is this window. Let's see. Yeah, it is with this one. So it has an application that starts the music, but it also has a built-in detail screen that is nicely formatted with a list of numbers, track list, and a picture. So this is the complete demo, but because we don't have that much time, let's skip the details page. But it also works. It's similar to what we did before. Yeah, so I hope you had a first impression of how you would build application using Flutter. And the nice thing is that you actually can have a quite short loop of feedback when building widgets and looking at the screen and see how the effect is. It is 60 frames per second performance that Flutter realizes, so it actually feels quite native, and the applications they built with it are super impressive. Dart is a language that can be used in the backend as well, so it can be used instead of JavaScript in Node.js. And you can use Dart to create HTML applications. There's also Dart Angular Dart, and it uses the Dart language with the Angular technology to create web applications with components. So Dart is a language that is quite universal, and Flutter is a framework, or yeah, it actually is a library with a lot of widgets that let you create native mobile applications. So I hope you was impressed by what I showed you, and I hope you understood what I did here. And I invite you to look at my GitHub repo later on to look at the code and try it yourselves. With that being said, let me show you if I hooked up my phone onto this machine. So my phone is just sitting over there. Let's do a Flutter devices. Yeah? Flutter devices. So the iPhone, that works, but now it also has my OnePlus. Let's run this on my device. So now it adds the stuff to my phone. Yeah. Okay. So it builds the Android application. Stuff is deprecated, sure. Is there something happening? Yeah, okay. It built the app. So there's the APK. It boots up the application on my phone. So it actually has the application here running as well. Minor detail. The text in the app bar on the iPhone is centered. This guy here isn't. But it works the same, so I can do back. I can long press record. It works. So it's near the same result with one code base with a nice performant application. So that's it. If there are any questions, feel free to ask them. Or if you want to play around with this application on my phone, now's your chance. Thank you for your attention.